It's one of the biggest crime mysteries of the past century. How did Fred and Rose West become Britain's most prolific and sadistic serial killing couple?
They derive so much pleasure, sexual and otherwise, from the pain of others.
At their height, they murdered a girl every 3 months, claiming at least 12 victims. But how did the evil begin?
It was suggested that his mother told him when he was 12, you know, now you're 12, you've grown up, you've got to have sex with me.
There's evidence Rose also suffered sexual abuse as a child.
We have incest here. We have incest being repeated through the generations.
In their first in-depth interview, Fred's own family cast new light on the couple.
Well, I always thought she was possessed with the devil.
But was Rose's lack of morality caused by shock ECT therapy given to her mother when Rose was in her womb?
ECT at this time was still fairly brutal.
And did the head injuries Fred suffered as a teenager distort his personality?
His dad said he didn't seem to think that he was the same person.
With so many girls and young women disappearing, how did Fred and Rose get away with murder for so long?
The police never particularly joined up the dots. Social services never particularly joined up the dots.
This is the dramatic account of how Fred and Rose met and became killers. What was it in the backgrounds of Fred and Rose West that spawned them as killers? Much of Fred's childhood was spent in the West Country village of Much Marcle.
He grew up in the countryside, amidst the sort of the muck and beauty of the countryside, the mud and the flowers. It's a very, very beautiful place. And the local church is where the Wests have been baptized and married and buried for generations.
Fred's parents were Walter, a farm labourer, and Daisy, who'd been in domestic service.
The Wests were essentially the rural poor, so we're not talking about people who are well educated. I don't think Fred's father could even read and write. And they live in a tied cottage on a farm.
When we were smaller, our water used to get pumped up from the farm, up into a big tank at the back of the houses. You had an inside toilet, but there was no bathroom. So we used to bath in front of the fire on a Sunday, you know.
But something obviously went very, very wrong behind closed doors. Something very odd starts to happening, something very dark and sexual and perverse.
Fred was born in 1941. He was followed by 3 brothers and 3 sisters.
Fred wasn't the first child. There was a child before Fred, Violet, who died in infancy. And then Fred came along, and Fred was Daisy's firstborn child that lived, and he was her favourite. Fred would paint an impression of his mum being a rather formidable character who would shoot rats, for instance, and discipline the children.
She also defended her eldest in disputes. Years later, Rose would fit this role model.
Daisy provided Fred with a backdrop of powerful females that you must appease, but that may protect you and provide for you.
Fred's farmyard background also brought him into regular contact with blood and slaughter. He claimed he'd had to slit the throat of the family's pig, but his family say that was pure fantasy.
He never killed a pig in his life, because the bloke who was the pig killer used to work with Dad on the farm, and that was it. None of us touched any of that.
In his most serious allegations, Fred blamed his parents for his twisted attitude to sex.
Fred said in interviews with the police at various stages in his life, his dad had had sex with underage children, girls, and that Dad took the view that this was acceptable behaviour.
He also claimed his father had introduced him to bestiality.
He said his father had actually taught him to have sex with sheep. Also, it was suggested that his mother told him when he was 12, you know, now you're 12, you've grown up, you've got to have sex with me.
I suspect that there was a lot of shame in the family, and it's perfectly possible that those early experiences would have led Fred West to want to get his own back, to shame others in the way that he may have been shamed within this family.
But Doug West agreed to appear in this programme, partly to deny all allegations of abuse.
I can sit here and tell you that it's not true, because none of us was ever abused, anyway, by anybody. And I mean, as far as Mum and Fred and Dad and Annie, well, that's just fantasy by somebody.
Well, the allegation came from Fred himself. He said that.
Yeah, well, we all know what fantasise he is, don't we? From earlier about the pig.
Rose, brought up 150 miles away at Northam in Devon, had 15 years of turbulent childhood before she met Fred. Gillian Job, then a child, lived next door.
Would you say theirs was a happy house?
No, definitely not. Never saw no laughter going on, no. No. They went to school, they were home and they were in. Occasionally you saw them in the garden just sort of walking around, not playing. I don't know if they had any toys with them.
Rose's mother, called Daisy, like Fred's mother, had married a man called Bill Letts. Rose was the youngest daughter among 7 siblings. From the start of his marriage, before Rose was born, Bill was a tyrant.
I know you are. I'll take you something to eat shortly, all right? Just get on with your jobs and do a good job of them.
Will you shut up?
He would run his finger along the ledges to see if there was dust and so forth, and he would always find something. Then he would smash the kitchen up, beat his wife, the children were beaten.
What are you doing up here?
He didn't tell his wife he'd been diagnosed as schizophrenic in childhood.
Mum said that. I said you stay in the kitchen till it's clean! Get downstairs!
He once threw one daughter downstairs and banged the head of another against a wall.
Will you shut up? For God's sake! You're all in it together. Are you all against me now, are you? No, just leave him alone!
When Daisy intervened, he threw boiling water over her.
How could you do that? Hey, how can you do that to us?
One day, their neighbour Jill took Rose's older sister Joyce down to the seafront.
We were always out here anyway, playing, riding horses, swimming in the sea. This is the road here we came. And you're looking back into the village there. And we came out and we brought Joyce with us. And when we went back home, she had the hiding of her life, poor girl. And she was hose-piped down in the backyard, lots of shouting and screaming. And I remember my mum saying to me, listen, you've caused this, don't ever take her again. Well, which she didn't, no.
In 1953, Rose's mother Daisy entered a deep depression. She was 8 months pregnant with Rose, but this didn't prevent doctors from giving her brutal electroconvulsive therapy. Could Rose West's personality have been damaged before she was even born? In 1953, 15 years before Rose's fateful meeting with Fred, her mother Daisy was given ECT for depression. Daisy was 8 months pregnant with Rose.
ECT at this time was still fairly brutal.
Electrodes were clamped to Rose's mother's skull, and a current passed through her brain.
Rose was probably affected. The damage may have been mental, but the genetics from a cold, withdrawn, schizophrenic father and a mother who was depressed would probably outweigh the damage.
Rose was born on the 29th of November, 1953.
She was this absolutely beautiful child with these great big eyes and dark, glossy hair.
She was known as Dozy Rosie. As a child would rock herself physically backwards and forwards as if she wasn't quite right in the head.
At school, she quickly fell behind and was teased.
She found it very, very hard to mix with her peer group, and she was held down here. And she was kind of quite friendless and bullied at school.
Her father showed a surprise affection for his youngest daughter.
She has the singular quality in the family of not being knocked about by her dad. And this leads to suggestion that there was something sexual developing between father and daughter.
Many have suggested this lay at the root of what followed.
To abuse others, to control others, to hurt others, to see others in pain is all she knew as a child, and that would be normalised.
Rose played in a world of her own, cutting up sheets to make clothes for dolls.
Children who've been severely traumatised repeatedly, to manage that experience, often dissociate.
Rose!
They go off into another place, a place of safety. So they often appear as though they're not quite there. They're a bit dozy.
Rose was protected by her father, so she learned how to manipulate to get what she wanted. She knew she had to have an older man as a protector.
It would be another decade before Rose met Fred West, 12 years older than her and a willing protector. By 1956, Fred was 15 and had left school with the reading and writing age of a 7-year-old. He was working on a farm at Muchmarkle in Herefordshire. Nearby, at Ledbury, the market house was a magnet for teens. Fred had realised he could attract girls if he scrubbed up his appearance, and came here often with his brother, John.
He thought he was Jack the Lad. No, he enjoyed his life.
First time I remember Fred was when he used to go to dances.
Are you two doing today?
And I used to go too, and the girls were looking at him.
But Fred was already developing the crude approach with young women he'd adopt in future.
Hey, why don't you come over here for a bit?
It's not a kiss and a kind of chat up and let's go out, let's go to the pictures. It's grabbing a girl for sex. But he was also a coward. He wasn't a man who had confrontations with other men.
Who's that? You touch me again, get off him!
He wouldn't defend himself. John was just opposite. He'd be in and duff, and then you'd know about it. But Fred never did. That's why I could never understand how he was like he is.
Fred loved motorbikes, and aged 17, he bought one.
He did look after the bike. He cleaned it on a weekend, and he took a pride in his bike.
But one evening when he was riding home, a girl was cycling in the opposite direction. The girl had cuts and bruises, but Fred came off far worse. These were the days before compulsory helmets. Fred's skull and many other bones were shattered. For 7 days he lay unconscious in Hereford Hospital. Dr. Keith Ashcroft is an expert in the impact of brain damage on criminal behaviour.
If we consider a force acting on the front part of the head, then the energy would transmit through the brain, causing damage, because the brain is actually a jelly-like substance. And what would be interesting to note would be if there was any damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved in impulse control and emotional decision-making. This is one of the main areas of the brain implicated in psychopathy, giving rise to very serious offending behaviours such as what happened with Fred West.
Many around Fred felt he changed after the accident.
His dad said, like, he didn't seem to think that he was the same person. Well, the same personality then.
He now had a limp.
Long John Silver.
And there were the first signs of the aggression which would later lead to many murders with Rose. But she was still 9 years away. In 1960, aged 18, Fred met another girl, prepared to listen to the tall tales he now used as chat-up lines.
They could have buried me or anything, and I came back to life. No, I'm being serious. I came back to life.
Reena Costello, a 16-year-old from Coatbridge near Glasgow, came from a broken home and had been in court and sent to Borstal. She was now staying with relatives in England.
This is quite typical, actually, of the women who fall into Fred's orbit.
They were suited actually as a match because they were both tearaways. They were all together, you couldn't separate them.
She has a low self-image, self-worth. She allows herself to be used by men, and this is all part of what is exciting to Fred.
But Fred grew jealous. They argued, and after a few weeks, she returned to Scotland. With Reena gone, Fred turned his attention to other girls. Almost immediately, it landed him in trouble.
He tried to put his hand up the girl's skirt, going up the fire escape, and she knocked him back down him.
He fell 10 feet onto concrete and was knocked unconscious. Once again, he was taken to hospital in Hereford with brain damage. In Devon, Bill Letz's mental condition had grown worse. Rumours of his sexual interest in young girls had led to hostility, so he moved his family to Bishop's Cleeve in Gloucestershire. Rose was now just 20 miles from Fred. She entered adolescence and became highly sexual.
She would be walking around the house naked or parading in front of her father.
Rose now reacted aggressively if bullied, earning a fearsome reputation. If her younger brothers were attacked, she'd protect them.
She began to unleash that pent-up aggression that over the years had probably been built into her by the comments and ridicule from others.
Now aged 15 and just months from meeting Fred, Rose took a job which brought her into contact with older men serving at a roadside snack bar. She was frequently seen emerging from cabs after having sex with them.
She was looking for someone who was older, more in control, more powerful.
Police were called to investigate one older man who had sex with her, but no charges were brought. In the autumn of 1960, Fred West, in hospital with head injuries, regained consciousness after 24 hours. Those around him saw changes in both his appearance and behaviour.
He becomes even more sexually active, but sex was something to be taken from a person.
These changes echo the classic case used in neuroscience to show how a head injury can lead to increased aggression. Phineas Gage was a railway construction worker in the 19th century.
He was well respected, very nice guy. An explosive blasted a 3-foot metal tamping iron through the left side of his cheek up out of the top of his head. He appeared conscious and recovered quite well, but in fact his behaviour changed dramatically from a very presentable guy to one who's irascible, aggressive, lying, cheating. We assume that we have the control over our behaviour, but in fact in some instances our behaviour is completely biologically determined.
In the years after the accident, Fred showed clear signs of the perverted sexual behaviour that came later. In June 1961, age 19, it emerged not only had he been having sex with a 13-year-old girl, but she was pregnant.
The reason why he's interested in younger girls is partly because that's who he can seduce. People who would be his own age or superior to him would be repulsed by him.
The police were called.
It seems by his testimony at the time that he'd been raping this girl for several months.
His responses were revealing.
No problem with it.
Well, I'm sorry, but I've got a problem with that.
I don't know why. I mean, everyone does it.
No, I'm sorry.
Daisy, his mother, was outraged by this. The family knew the girl in question, and Fred had to leave home.
But the trial at Herefordshire Assizes in November 1961 collapsed. The 13-year-old refused to give evidence, and Fred was released. There was no formal monitoring by the authorities, no sex offenders register.
Police knew that here was somebody who was a paedophile. You do get a sense in which a number of people in positions of authority had intervened and could have intervened further.
A short time after the court case, Reena Costello, Fred's former girlfriend, walked back into his life. It was 1962. She was now 2 years older, had dyed her hair blonde, and had been working as a prostitute in Glasgow.
Fred is excited by prostitution and repelled by it. He's excited by women who would do what he wants, but he's also kind of disgusted by them. So there's some misogyny going on, but also lust.
In Glasgow, Reena had broken up with an Asian bus driver after becoming pregnant with his child. She travelled to England, took a job as a waitress at Ledbury in Gloucestershire, and met up again with Fred. Her unwanted pregnancy excited him.
What are you doing here?
Come to see you, ain't I?
I've told you, don't come and see me at work.
He wanted to perform an abortion.
Look, you've got a little problem. Oh, you've got to let me sort it for you.
I don't know, is it safe?
What?
This would have fitted into his sadistic sexual approach to females. They were objects for his pleasure, and his pleasure might not just include sex, but the invasion of their body with objects.
At the time, abortions were illegal. Fred took Reena to nearby woods and tried to abort the baby. But they were spotted, the police were called, and he had to stop. Reena decided to keep the child, and weeks later, in Ledbury, they married.
It's a quick ceremony. There's one photograph taken, and years later when Reena went missing, this was the missing poster photograph. Where is Reena?
They moved to Reena's hometown, just outside Glasgow, where the baby was born. Fred was now married to a woman who'd had another man's daughter. She called her Charmaine. Fred immediately took against the baby.
What's the matter with her?
Reena returned to prostitution, with an instant impact on her sex life with Fred.
He would suddenly grab her and demand to have sex, and this sex is really essentially rape. And it would be very short, and he often couldn't perform sexually. As time went on, he found it harder and harder to get excited. Sex became fetishized, and one of the fetishes was that the women that he slept with were sleeping with other men.
But outwardly, they pretended everything was fine. Fred took Reena and Charmaine to see his family in Muchmarkle.
That was it. It was the family reunion. Because nobody'd met her, not as his wife until then.
Fred dreamed up a number of stories to suggest he was leading a glamorous life in Scotland.
And there are all sorts of strange elements to this fictional life of Fred in Glasgow, one of which is that he's mixed up in organised crime, and one is that he's a pimp running prostitutes.
He boasted of the silk shirts he said he normally wore.
Not today, obviously. Thought that was a bit posh for Muchmarkle.
The truth was very different. Fred ran an ice cream van. He found it the perfect way to meet the young girls he remained obsessed with. But as we reveal for the first time, he was about to find out what happened to paedophiles in the violent slums of Glasgow. The Crumbles in Glasgow was notorious in the early 60s as a gang-controlled slum area. It was here Fred West had his ice cream round, bringing him into contact with many teenage girls. The Crumbles was home at the time to writer Colin McFarlane, who was then aged 10 and remembers Fred clearly.
It was very, very rough at the time. So for a little Englishman to arrive there in an ice cream van, it was a completely incongruous thing to do.
Colin and his young mates were Fred's customers. One day, Colin witnessed Fred's temper.
Word had got around that he had a sort of fascination for girls about age 12 or so.
There you go, 2 singles.
Fred the perv. Fred the pervert.
All right, any more of that, and I'll throttle you with this, all right?
All of a sudden, I just realised I was perhaps looking into the eyes of a potential murderer.
In 1964, Fred's wife Reena gave birth to their daughter, Anne-Marie. Fred doted on her, in sharp contrast to his treatment of his stepdaughter, Charmaine.
Fred wasn't at all nice to Charmaine.
No, you can't have an ice cream. You'll ruin your tea. Now get out of it.
And she was bullied and abused and locked up and knocked about and just treated like you wouldn't treat a dog from day one.
Reena knew Fred had been unfaithful and began an affair of her own with bus driver John McLaughlin. Fred found out.
What's going on here then, eh?
Fred, don't.
You.
Nothing. What?
Get out.
He punched Reena and slashed John McLaughlin with a knife.
Get home, I said.
After that, he stayed with Reena but became increasingly controlling towards her and the girls. He took on a nanny named Isa McNeil, who was shocked to see how the girls were treated.
Charmaine is sleeping in a bunk bed at this stage, and Fred builds a slatted cage around it, so she's in a sort of a prison cell.
Through Isa, another girl entered Fred's life. Anna McFall was in her mid-teens and from a broken family, like so many of the girls who would later become a victim of the Wests. Fred found her attractive, but before any relationship developed, his spell in Scotland came to an abrupt halt. In 1965, he ran over and killed a 4-year-old boy. No charges were brought, but local people were angry. And until now, it's been thought this is what drove Fred away from Scotland. But writer Colin McFarlane recalls local people were already angry with Fred over his fascination with young girls. Power on the streets of the Gorbals lay with the feared razor gangs.
If you had a complaint about a suspected paedophile, you could actually approach the gang members who would sort them out for you.
Colin remembers how one day a senior gangster turned up where Fred had his ice cream round.
Here, seen that wee Fred about?
And I said, no, he hasn't been around for a couple of days. He says, well, we're looking for him.
You'll let us know, won't you?
The gangster promised young gang members that anyone who did Fred in would be rewarded. Minutes later, Fred appeared.
The guys saw him, and that was a chance. They all ran towards the van. They had big knives and razors. Fred saw this, panicked, and sped off.
Fred, Reena and the children fled south, and in 1966 moved into a caravan not far from Much Marcle. He was now just 12 miles from where Rose was growing up in Bishop's Cleeve. Fred took a job with macabre links to what followed.
Fred was used to the gruesome activities of a farmyard. He revelled in them. So his choice for working in an abattoir was not that strange. He would learn how to dispose of animals, their death, and the skillful ways you remove sinew from bone and release that bone from the rest of the carcass.
That actually is what Fred later did to human beings.
It was a fate which would befall 2 out of 3 women who approached the caravan one day that June. Fred's relationship with Reena was still rocky, and she'd been spending time away in Scotland. She came back with Isa, the former nanny, and Anna McFall, the 16-year-old he'd found attractive. They all moved in together.
Fred's existence in the caravan with 6 people crammed in there would have intensified his sense of territoriality.
Right, I'm off to work. You don't go wandering off, right?
It'll be fine.
Oh, not it'll be fine. You stay here, right?
He became increasingly violent, increasingly demanding towards Reena. He wanted to know what she was doing every second of the day.
At the same time, Fred and Anna became close. She'd longed for him to come back from the abattoir, despite his often dark moods.
Don't tell me I don't see no dinner.
It's in the oven.
That's handy, innit? When I comes home starving.
He was increasingly ready to slap Reena.
I told you before! You shut up!
Reena and Isa secretly drew up a plan to escape. One day, when Fred was supposed to be at work, Reena's former lover John turned up with a mate to rescue them. But possibly tipped off by Anna, Fred surprised them.
What's going on here then, eh?
Come on.
Oh, you again? Back for some more, are you? Where's you going with that?
No. We've had enough of going.
What's going on then, Reena?
Getting away from you, we've had enough.
Right.
Come on, Pip. Like, you are. No, it's Come here. Come here. No. With you.
You're not going anywhere with that.
Fred, although he's shown nothing but cruelty towards Charmaine, he wants to keep the kids. He's very possessive of his children throughout his life.
are you? You show your face round here again, and I'll kill you.
Reena escaped, leaving Fred with the children and Anna McFall. She became Fred's lover, but at 16 struggled to cope with his children. Fred, as happened often, put the children into care, then brought them home again. But social services didn't intervene.
The fact that he kept moving his children in and out of care should have raised alarm bells. But on the other hand, there were reasons in terms of his own personal life and where he was living that probably objectively he couldn't have looked after them on his own. So in that sense, there's some sort of logic in it. It's the amount and the frequency that's the problem.
Later that summer, Reena returned to confront Fred and claim back her daughters.
Ah, you missed me.
Like hole in the head.
Come on, give us your hand.
She took the girls, but also stole some of Anna's belongings and fled to Scotland when her thieving was discovered. A Gloucestershire policewoman was sent to Glasgow to bring Reena back. WPC Hazel Savage would later play a key role in bringing the Wests to justice.
Hazel is the one, more than perhaps anybody in the police, who, to some extent, uncovers the story.
I nicked Anna's stuff out of spite, really. She's supposed to be my friend. She's sleeping with Fred, anyway.
He doesn't seem like much of a husband.
No, you're right, he's not much of a husband. He's violent with me and the kids. He's depraved sexually. If you know what I mean, he's no normal in that way. I don't know. He's not right in the head, I think he's probably mad.
What do you mean?
But Hazel Savage never forgot her conversation with Reena. And 28 years later, she was the officer who insisted Fred's patio at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester was dug up. In November 1966, Reena was given 3 years probation for theft by Gloucester Magistrates. She started spending time at the caravan when Anna wasn't there. Fred was now having to juggle 2 women, and he found it increasingly stressful, especially when Anna became pregnant and began talking about marriage.
Reena didn't know that Anna was pregnant with Fred's child, and Fred didn't want her to find out.
Fred's meeting with Rose was still 2 years away. For now, his loyalty was to his wife Reena, and he didn't want to lose her.
Fred kind of realised at this point that his overstretching of himself to try and maintain all these relationships was not going to work. Therefore, Fred was brought to the brink of a decision.
In July 1967, Anna McFall went missing. No one reported the fact to police. Fred always denied he'd killed her, but he did later tell police he knew the field just outside Much Marcle, where she was buried.
Fred West's killing career apparently began with Anna McFall.
When Anna's remains were at last found in 1994, they revealed many of the murderous techniques also found on the victims Fred killed with Rose.
Come here.
Anna was dismembered, using skills Fred had learnt at the abattoir. Her fingers, toes, wrist and ankle bones had been kept as trophies.
That body was mutilated in many ways, and that was a body that was pregnant with his child.
The unborn baby's skeleton was found curled at the side of Anna's remains.
This callousness shows the absolute depth of Fred West's psychopathy.
Anna's letters home to Glasgow stopped arriving, but friends simply assumed she'd moved on. With Anna out of the way, Fred's relationship with Reena once more blossomed. They moved into a new caravan and for a time lived peacefully as a family. But the caravan was in Bishop's Cleeve, virtually on the doorstep of 15-year-old Rose Letts, who'd recently been having sex with any older man who took her fancy. One evening in 1969, she and 27-year-old Fred were at the same bus stop.
Fred and Rose, well, it was a disaster, wasn't it? Their meeting, really.
All right, my love. Where are you two then, eh?
Rose West was surprisingly pretty when she was in her teens. You know, we see pictures of Rose West even now in which she's overweight and frumpy and has large moon spectacles. But there was a young girl there once.
She finds him repellent. She very memorably describes that he had green, ganky teeth.
Even though she was repelled at first, it only took a bus journey and they were bonding. Paedophiles soon work each other out, and I think that they were coming from the same place.
Here is this young woman who was pretty friendless, suddenly being chatted up by a man who was giving her attention.
This fateful meeting would result in at least 11 more deaths and meant one young girl had only 2 years left to live.
Stop breathing!
It was 1969, and 27-year-old Fred West had just met 15-year-old Rose Letts. He wooed her with extravagant gifts, possibly stolen, including a fur coat and lace dress.
You know what they say, don't you? Fur coat, no knickers.
His crudeness didn't put her off. She asked if he was married, but he said his wife was a prostitute in Glasgow and nothing but trouble.
In fact, Reena was still around. They just had a domestic row. They weren't together in the caravan. So this was a lie.
He knew that Rose liked children and invited her to the caravan.
Hey, girls, put that down, I've got someone for you to meet.
The filthy caravan was in sharp contrast to the meticulously clean home of Rose's childhood.
This is Rosie. Well, say hello then.
Hello there, girls. What are your names then?
Rose became a regular visitor. Her father, who it's thought had been sexually abusing Rose from childhood, now feared he was losing her.
Look, it's fine. He said he's going to pay for me.
I'm sorry.
For looking after the kids. He's going to pay for me. There's nothing going on between me and him, all right?
No, I'm telling you, you
Get
stop
out.
this. No, you stop this right now!
But Rose continued to visit the caravan and soon became Fred's lover. He introduced her to his family.
He said that she was the new nanny, but she was too loud for my opinion. And we never hit it off from the start.
With Rose, Fred could sink deeper into sadomasochistic sex. He also introduced her to prostitution.
Supposed to be here at 3.
When we've got a killer couple like Fred and Rose West, what we are dealing with is that French phrase, a folie à deux, literally a madness shared by two. And within every folie à deux, there's a dominant and a subservient partner. There almost seem to be no limits to Fred's sexual interests, and very quickly one sees Rose adopting that worldview.
Rose's father, Bill, soon found out about the prostitution.
He's absolutely furious and he's spitting nails and he wants this to stop.
Come on, Dad! You see him again and I'll disown you! Is that clear?
That's not fair!
You're mine. You're my little Rosie. You're my girl. Right. You stop seeing him, you get a proper job, and you can stay here. Otherwise, it's up to you.
And I choose Fred.
Soon, Rose was pregnant with Fred's child.
Rose saw the image of herself with Fred and some wonderful fantasy future in which she was both mother to his children and played the role of some kind of goddess in his life. Now, the reality of this was day to day, catering with and taking responsibility for children. It was going to be hard work.
Reena wasn't living in the caravan, and Rose was often left in charge of 2 girls, neither of whom was her child.
Girls, enough noise!
So how was she with the kiddies?
A bit abrupt. I mean, if she'd been my nanny, I'd have clobbered her.
Girls, enough! Enough! Shut up, both of you! Charmaine, I'm sick of this!
Charmaine was a very, very bright little girl and would challenge her, whereas Anne-Marie knew to keep the head down, and even so, you know, both were victims of awful violence from Rose.
In the spring of 1970, Reena reappeared at the caravan.
Hello. I'm Reena. I'm the kid's mum.
Oh. Charmaine, you two get back, please.
Okay, yeah.
She wanted her daughters back. She could have no idea this would be her last chance to save the life of one of them. The details of her conversation with 16-year-old Rose are unknown, but she didn't get her way.
For Rose, those children were objects of power. Those objects of power tied her to Fred, and that she would not let go of.
In June 1970, Fred and Rose rented a flat on Midland Road in Gloucester, and Rose gave birth to a daughter, Heather. Fred, under new financial pressure, resorted to theft. Late that year, at Gloucester Magistrates Court, he was jailed for 9 months.
This is an important development because it essentially means that Rose is left alone with the kids and she can't cope.
Do as I say! I won't! We'll see about that, madam.
Rose was barely 17. The main target of her stress was Charmaine, as witnessed once by Charmaine's best friend.
Can you believe her? I bet you're not so naughty.
Charmaine would not show fear. She would not cry in front of Rose. This was a massive challenge.
It's almost like, I'm not going to show that I'm vulnerable, I'm not going to show that I don't feel good enough, bearing in mind that she'd been abandoned by her mother, or that's what she believed.
Years later, Anne-Marie would recall how Charmaine promised her Reena would one day rescue them. In March 1971, 8-year-old Charmaine was taken to Gloucestershire Royal Hospital with an ankle wound, possibly caused by a knife. It was a last missed opportunity to save her life.
The violence towards children was spiralling, particularly with Charmaine, who presented at A&E with Rose, and nothing came of that. There was no checks to find out what was going on.
Rose and Fred exchanged gushing love letters while he was in prison, but there were deeply menacing sections about Charmaine.
Darling, about Char, I think she likes to be handled rough. But darling, why do I have to be the one to do it? And I hate it.
In June 1971, days before Fred was due for release, Rose's temper pushed her beyond the brink. Rose has never said what happened that day or how she murdered Charmaine.
You stupid little girl! You're done!
Charmaine!
But when Anne-Marie returned from school, Charmaine wasn't there.
Anne-Marie comes home and Rose tells the lie which she would tell for the rest of her life.
She's not here.
Where is she?
Your mum turned up. She's gone to live with her. That's what Charmaine wanted, isn't it?
Rose didn't want Charmaine to survive because as long as Charmaine lived, that was an excuse for a woman that Fred had had a relationship with to continue to be in Fred's life.
Fred was the only person told the truth. There's no evidence he was angry with Rose. It was probably at this point he told her he'd killed Anna McFall.
Fred has killed, and so has Rose. And therefore they have this joint enterprise from that moment on together that they are both killers. They're both locked in a deadly embrace.
Next week,
Rose had grabbed my legs and held them apart, and he was beating me between the legs.
the dramatic stories of the women that got away from Fred and Rose, and the ruthlessly efficient system which ensured many others did not, when they were drawn into the clutches of Britain's most prolific serial killing couple. Fred and Rose West are Britain's most prolific and sadistic serial killing couple.
They derive so much pleasure, sexual and otherwise, from the pain of others.
How did an ordinary family home in Gloucester become a sordid den of sex, vice and murder?
Nothing prepared me for what I met with Rose. Nothing.
A place of orgies and prostitution, converted into a torture chamber.
You want to believe that they're going to let you go, that nobody can be that bad.
12 girls and young women would be butchered before the killers were stopped.
I saw Rose as interested in violence and lesbian sex, pretty much in equal measure and preferably together, and that Fred's role was in many ways to assist her to fulfill her fantasies.
June 1971, and in the cellar of a flat in Gloucester, an 8-year-old girl lay dead.
Christ, girl. What you done?
It's believed Fred West had killed before and got away with it, but this was the first time Rose had taken a life.
From that moment on, there's a change in their relationship because they're locked in a deadly embrace. They both have, by that moment, killed.
The girl in the cellar was Fred's 8-year-old stepdaughter, Charmaine. She'd been living with Fred and Rose at their flat on Midland Road in Gloucester. Fred wasn't the girl's father. She was the daughter of his estranged first wife, Reena. Also in the house was Fred's daughter with Reena, Anne-Marie. 17-year-old Rose had been left looking after the girls while Fred was in prison, serving a 9-month jail sentence for theft.
There was a bad relationship from the start between Rose and Charmaine. Rose knocked her about and mistreated her and was very cruel towards her.
While Fred was in prison, the level of abuse suffered by Charmaine increased. Rose was adept at hiding it, even from Fred's family.
He was strict on the kiddies, so I mean, fair enough. But I mean, apart from that, there was no evidence that anything else was wrong.
Rose had killed Charmaine on her own. Fred had been locked up at the time.
We better get this sorted out.
But he now took charge of disposing of Charmaine's body, becoming party to the crime.
It's what's called joint enterprise. If you and I take part in a conspiracy to murder somebody, and I strangle them and you hide the body, we're both guilty.
Fred buried Charmaine behind the flat. He always denied dismembering the body, but the facts suggest this was a lie.
Fred insisted that he couldn't bring himself to mutilate a child. But in fact, when her remains were found, her skeleton wasn't intact, and parts were missing.
Rose has always denied she was involved in any of the 12 murders, but Charmaine's death became key evidence at her trial.
Fred was in jail during that period, and we were able to establish that that Charmaine was at home with Rose, and so the jury was satisfied that Rose was the person who killed Charmaine.
Very best friend, hadn't she?
At the time, Fred and Rose avoided suspicion by giving neighbours a cover story they'd stick to for the next 24 years.
She's gone to live with Reena, her mother. Good bloody riddance too.
Fred's family was spun the same line. When they came to visit, all seemed normal.
Children used to go and play together, and we'd have tea and chat and something, and that was it. We never ever see anything. They hid it well.
But within days, the first crack appeared in the relationship between Fred and Rose. She walked out on Fred and returned to her family home, and to the father who, it's suggested, had sexually abused her from an early age.
Rose's childhood had been difficult, and her father, Bill Letts, had been an aggressive, violent, difficult man.
He'd washed his hands of Rose over her attachment to Fred.
Look, I finished with him.
You made your bed, girl. You lie in it.
But this is my home.
It's not my problem.
Dad!
Fred came to fetch her back. This conversation was repeated in court when Rose's mother testified against her.
Come on, Rose.
It formed key prosecution evidence.
You know what we've got between us. If you ain't out of here in 10 minutes, there'll be another woman in our bed.
Don't look at me. You know what I think.
You don't even know him. You don't even know him. There's nothing he wouldn't do. Not even murder.
The die is cast. Fred and Rose, from then on in, are pretty much a solid couple.
Rose was back with Fred, and he thought he'd got away with murder, again. But they hadn't counted on the tenacity of Charmaine's birth mother, Reena. The previous year, she'd visited Fred and Rose's caravan to try to get Charmaine and Anne-Marie back. But Rose had refused to hand over the girls. Now, a year later, Reena was back, looking for her children. She called to see Fred's father, Walter. He was surprised, because he'd believed the cover story that Charmaine was with her in Scotland. Increasingly anxious, Reena left to find Fred.
She's asking Fred, and he's palming her off with a lie, because of course she can't have Charmaine back, because Charmaine is dead.
Reena's persistent questions had become too dangerous for Fred and Rose. Finally, Fred said he would meet her to take her to Charmaine.
Took your time.
It was a promise that could only lead to one ending. In mid-1971, just 2 months after Rose had murdered Fred's 8-year-old stepdaughter Charmaine, her mother, Fred's first wife Reena, returned to Gloucestershire and asked to see her daughter. Fred and Rose knew Reena may discover the terrible truth.
We suspect that Reena didn't really know the full depth of Fred's depravity. She probably didn't know that he was a killer. He lies to her. He says, I'll take you to Charmaine, but first let's have a drink. He gets her drunk.
It's believed when she could no longer resist, he murdered her in his car, asphyxiating her. Years later, chromium tubing and a toy red boomerang would be found with her remains.
Fred and Rose both had this absolute obsession, the idea of perverse use of objects, of using rubber, of containment, of tubing.
It's thought Fred took Reena back to Midland Road to dismember her. He kept a kneecap and other bones as trophies. He buried her in a field near Muchmarcle. In the field next door lay the 16-year-old girl believed to be Fred's first victim, his lover, and the children's former nanny, Anna McFall. Though Fred always denied killing Anna, in 1994 he took police to the graves of both young women. No one reported Reena missing.
Well, we assumed she'd gone back to Scotland.
With Reena and Charmaine out of the way, the relationship between Rose and Fred entered a new phase.
She was sort of gradually taking over him. She was becoming more and more the boss, which eventually she took over completely.
Fred and Rose married in January 1972 and went on honeymoon.
But the really weird part about this is that it's not just Fred and Rose, it's Fred and Rose and another girl who they've picked up somewhere along the line, who is part of this bizarre menage.
18-year-old Rose was pregnant and wanted a bigger home for their growing family. They bought a house that would become Notorious, 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester's Bedsit land. Catherine Halliday rented a flat nearby.
At Cromwell Street, you could be anonymous and live in it because it was a lot of bed and breakfast, DSS. People came and went all the time. You didn't stay in Cromwell Street for very long.
From the start, sex was at the centre of life there for Fred and Rose, as the trial later heard from 2 lodgers.
Within hours of moving into 25 Cromwell Street, Rose slept with them. And soon, almost everyone was sleeping with everyone else.
Years later, when Fred and Rose faced trial, Howard Ogden was appointed as Fred's solicitor.
He was rather in her shadow, and I felt that she was the strong one. I saw Rose as someone who was interested in violence and lesbian sex, pretty much in equal measure and preferably together, and that Fred's role was in many ways to assist her to fulfill her fantasies.
Neighbour Catherine Halliday saw at first hand how this worked. She first met Fred in her flat.
There was nothing at all in Fred's way to suggest anything but a bumbling, goofy builder, happy-go-lucky chap, and that is how he came across. I liked the guy. When I first met him, I liked him.
He quickly established she was lesbian.
Yeah, he wants to pop up and see our Rosie. She loves a bit of that, you know.
Catherine accepted the invitation, and Fred took her into Rose's bedroom.
Nothing prepared me for what I met with Rose. Nothing. All of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I just caught this image of this woman, naked, coming into the room. Now, I'm pretty broad-minded, but that took me completely off my balance. She just draped herself over me. We didn't make love, we had sex. Fred didn't join in. It was her and me. And all the time he was on about Rose and give Rose a good time and she'll give you a good time.
Catherine returned to the house for sex sessions several times.
But she was very, very domineering, very much so. And she was quite domineering over Fred too.
You want to go make yourself useful? Go get my dressing gown.
He only ever touched me once. We only ever had sex once. But he was a wee bit more gentle. But she was very cold, very cold.
Shortly after moving into Cromwell Street, Fred began converting the house so he and Rose could explore sadistic sex.
And one of the most sinister things he does is that he turns the basement of the house into a torture chamber.
One of the first girls he took there was his own 8-year-old daughter, Anne-Marie. She later described in court how Fred and Rose raped her and told her she should be grateful. She said she wanted to die.
For Fred, the introduction of sex into a girl's life experience was the role of her father. It was the father's responsibility to break in their daughters. You don't want any other bastard doing that, he said, do you?
Shortly after Fred and Rose began abusing Anne-Marie in 1972, they met a 16-year-old, Caroline Owens. Her story provides a unique insight into what awaited their victims.
It was almost like, oh yeah, we're just going to rape you or decently assault you. And because we're going to make you a cup of tea after, then we can't be all bad. It was... There is a word I'd like to use, but I can't.
What is it?
Edfuck. Complete edfuck. Because you really... You want to believe that they're going to let you go, that nobody can be that bad. But a part of you don't believe it.
The information that Caroline Owens was able to give us was really very, very important in the case. What happened to her in 72 was a thread that then ran through the other cases.
It began late that year, as Caroline was hitchhiking to her family home after being with her boyfriend. Fred and Rose had started trawling the countryside for girls to join Rose in prostitution.
They'd come back and say they'd been trying to pick up girls out of care who had nobody, so obviously wouldn't be missed.
Hi there, darling. Want to hop in? It looks like you're going our way. That'd be great.
During the journey, Caroline revealed she had problems at home and was looking for work.
Oh no, we're after a nanny.
Oh, right. Oh, that'd be really good.
Yeah, brilliant.
She was going to be the nanny of a man and a woman who were married and who had children and who seemed outwardly to be respectable.
It was quite a nice atmosphere to begin with. They were very, they had a bawdy sense of humour, which was crude, but also could be funny. There were other times when it felt a bit strange, a bit uncomfortable.
Right, Car.
Hi, Rose.
The kids been all right?
They've been fine.
Oh, good.
Fred offered to help if she ever had an unwanted pregnancy.
He said to me, yeah, I've performed these abortions before and they're so grateful they just turn around and have sex with me straight after, which I thought, that's not right, that's weird.
Caroline soon saw signs of Rose's aggression towards 8-year-old Anne-Marie, the daughter of Fred and Reena.
I'm just going to get a glass of water. Okay.
Rose lost her temper with her on a few occasions.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
I'm just going to get a glass of water.
You'll have absolutely nothing back in your bed now!
One evening, Fred was explicit about Anne-Marie's sexual abuse.
She ain't no virgin.
Anne-Marie was in the room at the time and I saw her face go down and blush.
Why would you... What do you mean she ain't a virgin? Why ain't she a virgin?
I think it was almost like a test to see if I was curious. I think he thought that he could groom me.
Hey, nothing like that now.
Fred backtracked, coming up with a story to explain away what he'd said.
He said, oh, she had an accident on a push bike and the saddle came off and the part the saddle sits on penetrated her.
Fred now feared Caroline might reveal what he'd said. She was about to discover how manipulative he could be. Since moving in, she cheated on her boyfriend with a lodger, and Fred and Rose had found out.
You want to be careful about what you're thinking, innit?
He was blackmailing me.
You wouldn't want your boyfriend finding out about all this bed-upping you've been doing here.
However, Fred's hostility soon evaporated. He and Rose tried to draw Caroline into their world.
You all right then, Car?
The characteristic manipulation by psychopathic individuals is one of charm and disarm. It's a cat and mouse game.
He said, oh, there's me and Rose, a couple of friends, we've got a sex circle.
That's something you might be interested in?
I knew that was definitely something I didn't ever want to be a part of.
Caroline had seen and heard enough. Just weeks after taking the job, she walked out on the Wests. But she wasn't out of their clutches yet. Rose had wanted sex with Caroline and was furious. She and Fred devised a plan to use their charm to abduct and rape her. Caroline was vulnerable. Age 13, she'd been sexually assaulted by an old man in public toilets.
He's lying. Why are you believing him?
The incident destroyed her self-esteem and trust in the establishment.
People not only did not believe her, they actually sympathized with the person that she'd accused of the sexual assault. This is the 60s. This is before we began to really understand about the levels of sexual abuse against children in our culture.
I just felt like nobody cared about what happened to me, and I just felt I was doomed to probably die young and probably at the end of some crazy person of some sort. And it was almost like, you know, I don't care.
She was very nearly proved right. On December the 6th, 1972, now age 17, she was hitchhiking home after seeing her boyfriend, Tony.
Rose knew exactly where Caroline would be and at what time of the night, and they set out and trailed her.
Fred later told police the plan that night was to sexually assault and perhaps murder Caroline.
Car!
I was thinking they're going to be really angry with me because of how I left.
Car, darling, what are you doing? Come on. Look,
we're so sorry about before. Look, we're all really missing you. All of us, the kids, we were really hoping you'd come home.
Come on, car, get in.
Come on, get in the car.
We're having a laugh.
This is awful weather. You're home. Come on, get in. Get in.
Rosie will get in the back with you.
Caroline Owens had no idea she was about to become the only known victim to survive a full-on attack by Fred and Rose. Caroline pretended to go along with the plan and went with Rose and the West's baby daughter May to the laundrette. Then she made her escape.
Here you go, Rose.
Oh, hello.
Oh. She's gonna go get some fags, all right?
Caroline's mother persuaded her to go to the police, where a detective questioned her to test her story.
He was quite a big, intimidating guy. It was like he was accusing me, saying, well, you've had sex with this person, you've had sex with that person. It just made me feel really bad about myself.
Caroline couldn't face a similar grilling in court, so didn't press charges of rape.
This is before we really started to think long and hard about how rape victims were treated by the police and by the criminal justice system when they went to court.
Instead, Fred and Rose were jointly charged with indecent assault causing actual bodily harm. In January 1973, they were fined a total of £100.
Here's the thing, they learned from that attack on Caroline. They learned one particular thing, that if they didn't want to get arrested and charged and appear in court, then the next time they wouldn't let their victim survive.
There was so much just guilt about all that. I just made everything worse. It's almost like, oh wow, we got away with it. But only by the skin of our teeth. So next time they gotta die.
We now move into another phase of their murderous career, whereby they murder a series of young girls as part of a depraved campaign of rape.
Cromwell Street became a killing factory. Over the next 9 months, 3 girls would die. 19-year-old Linda Goff was the girlfriend of a tenant. Like Caroline, the Wests asked her to be nanny. In April 1973, she left a note for her parents, saying she was leaving home. She moved in with the Wests.
You know, you've got the loveliest face.
Now, they could pick their moment. Linda was gagged and bound, like Caroline. It's not known how long Fred and Rose kept her alive.
People assume these are girls who were simply murdered in some traditional way, in that you're suffocated or you're stabbed or whatever it was. These did not come into that category.
Many of the West's victims were tortured. Several of Linda's bones were missing when her dismembered remains were found. Fred claimed he cut up bodies so they'd fit in a small, quickly dug grave. But Linda's burial shows this was a lie. She was dumped in his vehicle inspection pit, which could easily have held her intact body.
The truth surely is that he enjoyed cutting her up.
But on this, their first sex killing, they made 2 miscalculations. Firstly, Rose sorted through Linda's clothes and kept the one she liked. Secondly, Linda had a mother concerned enough to come looking for her.
When we recovered Linda Goff's remains, we interviewed both parents, and it was a very touching and almost surreal description by Mrs. Goff of going round to Cromwell Street.
She saw Linda's clothes on the washing line.
Right. Hello?
I'd like a word with Linda. I'm her mum.
Linda? Oh no, Linda's moved. She moved to Western Supermare. She's looking for work.
She said that as she looked at Rose, she noticed that Rose was wearing Linda's slippers.
Glad to see the back of her.
I just want to have a word.
The Goffs presumed Linda had left some belongings behind. They told a neighbour, who was a policeman, that she was missing. But as Linda wasn't thought vulnerable, it wasn't pursued. The Goffs tried to trace her themselves, but in the end, simply accepted Rose's account.
The normal response is, my daughter's gone. I don't know where she is. But I suspect what happens is The parent thinks, well, I know that they're trying to make something of themselves.
Within weeks, the West set out to kill again. They'd fine-tuned their system for abduction and killing.
Victim choice is absolutely crucial in relation to thinking about the West as serial killers. One group tended to be much younger, have very damaged backgrounds, and were often not even reported missing because there was nobody to report them as missing. They were runaways.
The Wests used the hitchhiker abduction technique they developed with Caroline Owens. On the 10th of November 1973, they spotted Carol Ann Cooper. She was 15 and living in a children's home in Worcester.
There was evidence later that Fred had pre-prepared her grave.
This is for you. What do you mean? What do you think?
The basement becomes not only the torture chamber, but the burial place for several of the victims, starting with Carol Ann Cooper.
She was reported missing, but to West Mercia Police, not Gloucestershire. The couple's next victim, in December 1973, was from a very different background. She was 21, a university student, living with her mother near Cheltenham.
Lucy Partington is middle class. She's the niece of Kingsley Amis, the famous novelist, cousin of Martin Amis, also a famous novelist.
She is part of the second distinct group of victims, educated, older than the first group of victims.
Sweetheart, what are you doing waiting for a bus in this horrible weather?
And I think Rose was quite central, crucial in convincing intelligent young women that it was safe to accept a lift from somebody like Fred West.
It's not known how long Lucy's ordeal lasted. It's believed Fred and Rose did not allow all their victims to die quickly.
An act-focused serial killer simply wants the victim dead as quickly as possible. Process-focused serial killers, like the Wests, want to stay in the moment of killing for as long as possible because it's those moments of killing that give them the greatest amount of psychosexual pleasure.
Lucy was reported missing, and there was a big murder investigation. But as with Carol, no link was traced to the Wests. In April 1974 came another 21-year-old educated victim. Teresa Siegenthaler, a Swiss sociology student, was on her way from London to Holyhead.
The West had worked out how to disappear people, how to abduct smoothly, efficiently, kill, and disappear those victims without anybody being able to trace those victims back to Fred and Rose.
That November, Shirley Hubbard, a 15-year-old in care, was subjected to an extreme form of bondage.
When they found her remains, she'd been encased in tape and other bonds, so she was almost in a cocoon. And to make sure that she could breathe whilst they tormented her, they inserted this pipe into her nasal passage so that she could be tortured and her scream would be completely muffled.
Months later, Juanita Mott, 18 and from a broken home, became the next victim. Her family never reported her missing. Hers was the 5th burial in the cellar, which was now full. The house was already a brothel, and at about this time, the West began prostituting Fred's daughter, Anne-Marie, now aged 12.
They introduced her to men they meet in pubs.
Get in.
To some of Rose's clients.
It's believed the Wests were also physically abusing their children, because they were taken to accident and emergency 31 times.
They took them to different hospitals. They didn't always take them to the same hospital. They were smart like that. But we had children with sexually transmitted disease. I think on one occasion, well, hang on, how did that happen to a child?
If a number of agencies had just joined up the dots, then we wouldn't be sitting here talking today about the numbers of young women who would end up murdered.
The next victim wasn't killed for sexual thrills. Shirley Robinson, who was 18, made the fatal mistake of coming between Fred and Rose. She moved in as a lodger in 1977.
You right there, my darling? You get everything sorted, okay? I think so.
It would later be claimed in court she developed a sexual relationship with both Rose and Fred.
She becomes pregnant with Fred's child. He really likes her, and as she grows closer to Fred, there's the feeling within the household that he may actually leave Rose.
Shirley had become a threat to Fred's marriage.
Hey, meet my next wife.
Fred chose Rose. Shirley felt abandoned and threatened. In May 1978, 8.5 months pregnant, she was murdered in a frenzy. Shirley's body was found smashed apart, probably with an axe.
When she dies, her child dies, and this is Fred's child. Essentially, what we see is a double murder. Not only is it a double murder, it's the murder of his own child.
The baby's tiny skeleton was found alongside its mother. The number of Fred and Rose's joint victims now stood at 8. Their killing and betrayal was about to sink to new depths.
I said what?
In 1994, when the West's crimes were at last exposed, police faced questions about how so many girls could simply vanish.
We need to be clear about what information the Gloucestershire police had. Only 1 or 2 of these people had ever been reported missing in Gloucestershire.
One of those was Alison Chambers, aged 16, the West's last known sadosexual murder victim. In 1979, she lived at Jordan's Brook Care Home in Gloucester. Fred had started hanging around outside to offer lifts to girls. Like others, Alison was taken back to meet Rose.
She has this rather touching fantasy of the life that she would like to lead, which is living in the country in a sort of cottage with, ivy round the door.
Rose showed her a property she said she and Fred owned.
When you're 17, you can come and visit us on our farm.
In fact, the photo came from an estate agent's brochure. Alison was completely taken in and wrote to her mother she'd moved in happily with a family. She was murdered one day that August. A belt wrapped around her skull was still there when her body was found.
After her disappearance, her parents received some information, I think it was a postcard or something, where they were satisfied that Alison was safe and well. Other children, their parents knew they'd gone missing but did not report it to the police. So the police in Gloucestershire had no reason to believe that any of these people were victims.
The Wests were increasingly fearful their own children would reveal what they knew. To prevent Anne-Marie talking after school, she was forced to run straight home and was beaten if late.
The Wests are very nervous. This is a very dangerous time.
Shortly before her 16th birthday, Anne-Marie left home in 1980. With her gone, Fred attempted to have sex with his younger daughter, Heather.
No, get out!
Shush now, Heather.
No!
I told you a dad can touch his children.
No, I told you, get out!
And I told you, didn't I? A dad can touch his children.
No, get out! No, get out!
It's my right! She's a bloody lesbian, I'm telling you.
What do you think you're doing, talking to your dad that way?
Get out!
And then there starts this story, Fred and Rose would repeat ad nauseum, that Heather was unnatural, that she was a lesbian, that she was giving children drugs, which I'm sure was all completely untrue.
By 1987, there were 8 children living in the house, with Heather the oldest at 16. The youngest was just 4 years old. Tensions deepened after Fred and Rose discovered Heather had mentioned details about her home life at school, including the fact that Rose had lovers at Cromwell Street.
What she has to do is she has to get away, like Anne-Marie got away. And her ambition is to get a job that will somehow enable her to leave home.
In June 1987, Heather left school and was pinning her hopes on a possible job at a holiday camp.
Yeah, this is Heather.
Oh.
One of the kids told me that she
Right.
cried when she told that she wasn't going to get the job. And really, this was her death sentence. One day that she was in the house with her siblings, they went to school, they came back from school. It was a rainy day, they remember, and when they came home, Heather wasn't there.
Heather's remains showed her murder, dismemberment and decapitation were done in a frenzy.
This was an explosion of Fred's innermost rage inflicted on someone who stood in his and Rose's way.
Heather's body was stored overnight in a bin under the stairs. Her brothers and sisters were told the bin was full of old plaster and that Heather had left. Fred's family, including his then 7-year-old niece, were spun the same cover story, which would stick till the arrests.
I remember Grandad asking Fred once how she was getting on, and Rose answering instead of Fred and saying that she'd got some job in some holiday camp somewhere, and they got a letter if she felt like it, and they were letting her live her life.
In fact, Heather was buried beneath Fred's new patio in the garden behind 25 Cromwell Street. His niece, Sam, joined the barbecue party to celebrate its completion. Heather was the last known murder victim, killed because Fred and Rose feared she'd talk. But others survived to expose the truth. Catherine Halliday began her relationship with Rose a year later.
We'd chatter, we would laugh and we'd talk and different things, and we'd watch blue movies. But then she started to get really, really heavy. This is what we call.
Fred and Rose produced a secret suitcase. Inside were implements of sexual torture and rubber gimp suits.
That just made me realise it's time to go, get out when you can, because they had little zips across the mouth, had no nose holes for breathing, or no eye slits.
The sex became still more brutal. One day, Catherine found she'd been cut with a knife. She'd had enough and changed plans to spend Christmas with the Wests.
I think that is what saved my life. Rose went ballistic when I said I wasn't going to stay there. I survived Fred and Rose, and it scares me. It scares me that I allowed myself to come so close to death, if you like.
When Catherine agreed to make this film, she'd just been diagnosed with liver cancer. She knew she did not have long to live.
I said I would agree to do it because I wanted to prove that I survived Cromwell Street.
Catherine lived for 24 years after meeting the Wests.
It was nothing to do with them. They did not get me in the end. It wasn't them.
What finally called time on Fred and Rose was an admission by a 13-year-old girl.
I've been raped.
What? Are you being serious?
Next week, how terrible truths at last came to light, how only dogged police work exposed the full horror, and how even as justice was served, one of the deadliest murdering partnerships in history ended in bitterness, betrayal, and death.
She very, very obviously snubbed him.
For 2 decades, Fred and Rose West escaped justice. And by the early 90s, their ordinary family house had become a killing factory. They'd claimed the lives of at least 12 girls and young women.
Behind this facade of normality, they were murdering people for years and years and years.
That horror was about to be revealed on an unprecedented scale.
It's still one of the biggest cases the UK has had.
Body after body was recovered, but no one knew who the victims were.
This is a huge task to put one set of bones to an actual being.
the West's own children were among the victims.
People say, how do you feel about the victims' families? Or hello, it's nice to meet you. Because I am one of the victims' families.
But the most prolific and sadistic serial killing partnership in Britain was about to end in treachery and betrayal.
She's as wicked as he is. They were both as bad as one another, and I, for one, just hope she rots in hell.
When police knocked at the door of 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester on the 6th of August 1992, it wasn't murder they were investigating, but child abuse. A short time earlier, a 13-year-old girl had told a friend Fred had raped her.
It was filmed.
He filmed it.
The friend had told an officer who patrolled the beat near her home.
No, come on, we have to tell someone. We have to tell
No,
the
we
police.
When police arrived, the West's 5 youngest children, aged 9 to 15, were all in the house. Fred appeared unfazed, but Rose immediately reacted to the threat of exposure.
Straight away, the younger children were all taken into care, and Rose's life did start to fall apart.
She reacted so violently, she had to be restrained. But Fred was well used to brushes with the law after decades of petty crime. He left Cromwell Street and went to work as a builder as usual. At the house, officers began their search.
Police find and seize a great deal of evidence, and that includes bondage equipment, whips, all sorts of odd sexual implements, and also a huge quantity of pornography involving bondage, sadomasochism, cannibalism, incest, you name it. This is the full range of sexual perversion.
Police seized 99 VHSs, some featuring Rose filmed by Fred as she worked as a prostitute, plus some photographs showing the West children naked. But officers found no video of the 13-year-old who said she'd been raped. Rose was arrested and briefly held by police for aiding and abetting Fred to have sex with an underage girl, child cruelty, and obstructing officers. Police then went to the builder's yard where Fred was working.
Fred West?
Yeah?
I'm arresting you under charges of sexual abuse. Anything you say will be taken down.
He was taken in for questioning.
Come with us.
Howard Ogden, the duty solicitor brought in to represent Fred, found him surprisingly upbeat.
The earliest recollections of Fred are of this quite jovial chap who was obviously quite outgoing, who worked hard, and he was just an ordinary bloke.
But as police questioned Fred about the child abuse, a much darker side of his character emerged.
It was a father's duty, as he would put it, to break in his daughters.
You don't know where the bastard's doing it, do you?
He appeared to think that that was normal, and he couldn't understand why I or anybody else might think that that was unusual or unacceptable.
Leading the interrogation was Detective Constable Hazel Savage.
Hazel Savage had been a detective for many years. She was acknowledged as an excellent investigator.
She'd been aware of Fred's activities in a general sense, but now she's part of an investigation to child abuse, sexual child abuse at the house. And so this brings her squarely into contact with Fred and Rose, and this is a very significant development.
Hazel had come across Fred West 25 years earlier. In 1966, then still in uniform, she'd been sent to Scotland to question Fred's first wife, Reena, in a theft case.
Reena had painted a very unflattering portrait of Fred as a man who was promiscuous, violent, possibly dangerous, somebody whom she was worried about having custody of her children.
He's not right in the head, I think he's probably mad.
Reena had told Hazel she had 2 daughters. Charmaine was the child of a bus driver. Since Reena had split with Fred in 1969, she'd left both girls with Fred and Rose. After the interrogation, Fred was sent on remand to Gloucester Prison. for the rape of the 13-year-old girl. Rose was allowed home. But Hazel wanted to talk to Reena's daughter, Anne-Marie, now 28 years old and living in Gloucester. Rose knew Anne-Marie could reveal secrets that would prove catastrophic. Seconds before Hazel arrived at Anne-Marie's door, Rose rang her daughter and begged her not to talk to police.
This must have been a huge decision for Anne-Marie to break years of silence, the code of silence of the West, you know, don't say anything. Everything that happens at Cromwell Street happens in secret.
Do you see Hazel Savage?
Yeah, I know you are. Come in.
For the first time, the depravity of life at Cromwell Street was about to be laid bare.
It's a lie. I tell you, when I get my hands on Fred, he's a dead man.
After more than 20 years of rape, torture and murder, Fred and Rose were about to be exposed. One of their first victims was Fred's 8-year-old daughter, Anne-Marie. She had finally agreed to talk to Detective Constable Hazel Savage of Gloucestershire Police.
A lot had been bottled up. Basically, Anne-Marie had kept things back.
I was 8.
Anne-Marie bravely revealed years of physical, mental and sexual abuse by both Fred and Rose, and other men they forced her to have sex with.
Anne-Marie was tied up, implements were used, and she was raped repeatedly as a young girl in Cromwell Street.
And her interview also revealed the manipulative power of the abuse by Fred and Rose.
Curious thing is that she was quite forgiving, very forgiving in the circumstances, that Fred was still her dad.
When somebody is being abused by someone known to them who has the role as caretaker and to look after them, the focus for the victim is on surviving and to attach themselves to the person who's hurting them. This is a form of Stockholm syndrome.
Mum came.
Anne-Marie talked about her mother, Reena, and half-sister, Charmaine.
Have you got a number?
No. I don't know where either of them are.
It was natural for Hazel Savage to ask Anne-Marie where Charmaine was, where Reena was. And the bottom line is, Anne-Marie didn't know.
Hazel also asked her about her half-sister Heather, Fred and Rose's daughter, born 6 years after Anne-Marie.
Your dad or Rose ever said where Heather went?
Rose said that she was working in a holiday camp.
Did they say what camp it was?
I don't know, she just disappeared.
Heather hadn't been seen since 1987, age 16. Hazel's suspicions deepened.
Have you checked each year?
Hazel makes various checks.
Right.
She finds that there is no trace of Heather travelling on a passport, paying income tax, or having any kind of medical or dental work done on the NHS in all these years. Now, that's virtually impossible, unless A, you've changed your identity completely, B, you've gone to live in a foreign country, or C, you're dead.
Hazel decided to pull Rose in for questioning.
She was quite agitated at being at a police station and asking what on earth all this was about. It was as though this was an unwanted and unnecessary interruption in her life.
Is this a long conversation?
It's certainly an important conversation.
Well, I've got a job to go to and that's important. And I've got food to prepare and kids to look after.
I appreciate that, Mrs. West.
I haven't got time to spend in a cell.
Hazel asked Rose where Heather was. What Rose said in interview would later form key evidence at her trial.
Told me she was going to go and I said, please don't do so. We've got more to talk about. But I went shopping and I was gone for 2 hours as per usual. And when I got back, she'd gone. If my child don't want anything to do with me, there's nothing I can do about it.
She didn't create an entire fantasy, which would be easy to be undermined by systematic questioning. What she did was take little elements of what in fact was true.
I remember now why I didn't pursue Heather. Because things pointed to Heather being a lesbian.
A what?
A lesbian. But I didn't want the other kids exposed to that.
Are you a lesbian?
No.
In fact, many female witnesses would later testify to having been the victim of violent sexual assaults by Rose.
At that stage, there was nothing to suggest she was lying, and it didn't make me think that something terrible had happened to Heather and that she was no longer alive.
Fred, on remand for the alleged rape of the 13-year-old, told his children when they visited him that their sister Heather had already been to see him.
Oh no, she's doing very nicely. Working as a prostitute, making loads of money, selling her body.
In fact, Heather's dismembered body lay buried beneath the patio at 25 Cromwell Street. Rose was allowed home, but with her children in care because of the abuse case, she was stressed and lonely. On the 13th of August, a week after the raid, she took an overdose of pills and needed to have her stomach pumped. Her behaviour became increasingly strange. She'd wander around Gloucester with her shopping in a pram.
Rose, by this stage, is approaching 40. She's a middle-aged lady, rather heavy-set, dowdy-looking, but there's something really rather odd about her appearance. She tends to dress as a schoolgirl. She wears these white schoolgirl socks, but she dresses in other ways of somebody who's really a child.
Rose had actually adopted this new role. She went from being the dominant aggressor in the most horrific killing scenes to being a victim of the situation and someone who could never be the perpetrator of such sadistic violence, retreating into childhood safety and security.
She'd strip and gorge on chocolate eclairs whilst watching children's cartoons. As the trial for the assault on the 13-year-old loomed, the stress and separation rekindled the relationship between Fred and Rose.
Hello, my darling. How are you? Oh, I'm fine.
On the 7th of June, 1993, the trial for the abuse of the 13-year-old opened at Gloucester Magistrates Court.
Fred was charged with 3 counts of rape and buggery against an underage child, and Rose was charged with inciting rape and with child cruelty.
But before the jury could be sworn in, the 13-year-old girl decided not to testify, and the case collapsed. Fred and Rose's children remained in care, but they were free to go home.
Welcome home.
They had gotten away with it yet again, and this will have reaffirmed their ideas that they were pretty much invulnerable, so long as they stuck together.
With the case dismissed, the police no longer had need of the 99 porn videos seized from Cromwell Street. They were granted permission by Rose to destroy them, a move which later drew criticism.
Some of those videos might have contained images of some of the young women that the Wests had killed.
Would some of that video material have had links with what we found in terms of the victims? Then there's a possibility of that. But that's hindsight. The police can't keep things just in case something might happen in the future.
But although the case against the Wests was officially closed, one officer refused to stop investigating. Detective Constable Hazel Savage found out that a social worker had overheard an unusual exchange between the West children, who were still in care.
Get off, you'll get it in a minute. Give me the pen or I'll tell Mum and you'll end up under the patio like Heather.
The conversation about Heather being under the patio and the fact that Heather had disappeared without trace started to ring some alarm bells.
Hazel Savage begins to push to have a full-blown search done of Cromwell Street.
We need to dig up the garden.
Senior officers refused.
I can understand that there would have been some resistance.
We'll be a laughingstock.
You've got to convince a magistrate that this is not just a fishing expedition.
But 6 months later, one of the children said something to a social worker that could no longer be ignored.
Dad says we're not really allowed to talk about it, because if we do, we'll get murdered and put under the patio like Heather.
This time, Hazel Savage was back. 8 months after the rape trial collapsed, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street with a search warrant. They had no idea 9 bodies lay buried, and that they were about to be at the centre of an international media storm.
Rose West. Got a warrant here.
We were searching for the remains of Heather, and as far as we were aware, that was it.
The West's 21-year-old daughter was in the house.
You're flipping joking. Quiet, Dad! You're not coming in!
Fred was at work half an hour away.
They showed you the warrant? Right. I'll be right there.
In the garden, police began their excavation. But Fred didn't turn up for another 4 hours when the police diggers had already left for the day.
I'm sure that Fred would not be finishing off a little job at work under these circumstances. Probably he went immediately to try and hide evidence external to Cromwell Street.
The next day, the diggers were back.
This is work that Fred has done all his life. It's manual work, digging a hole. And he knows exactly where Heather is buried, and he knows where the other victims are buried. So he knows that it's not going to be long until they start uncovering human remains. And so he comes to a rather big decision.
You go asking for my mother? Rose. Nothing to do with my mother,
Rose,
father.
hey, calm down.
Go asking. It's an invasion of my privacy.
Mom.
It's an invasion of my privacy.
Just have a quiet word with Rose now, all right?
Fred, with a naive view of his prospects, made a pact with Rose.
They have an agreement that he will take the blame, she will continue to visit him, they will stay together. He believes he'll do just 12 years or so in prison.
All right. Take me away.
Fred put on one last show of innocence.
I've never done it!
Just get in the car.
I've never done it!
Just get in the car, Fred.
Did not kill my daughter. They're trying to say I killed her. I didn't do it. All right. I did it. I killed Heather.
That night, the story hit the screens. Watching the TV news was Caroline Owens. 22 years earlier, she'd been the West's nanny.
It said a man in Gloucester had been arrested on suspicion of his daughter being buried under the patio in the garden. And then it said his name. I already knew it was going to say his name, but it said his name.
Age 17, she'd been abducted and subjected to a 12-hour sexual ordeal by Fred and by Rose, who was then 19.
You stupid little bitch! We're gonna bury you under the paving stones of Gloucester!
We've got hundreds of girls down there. The police didn't find them and they won't find you!
I just broke down. It was just like... It was just like he'd come back again. And the girl that was killed was little Heather. It's little Heather. To me, she was 2. She was still 2 in my mind.
Others were stunned by the arrest.
I can remember on that night turning the TV on here at home. There were these neighbours saying, they've got it all wrong. Friend Rose, wonderful. Really, they're family people. They must have it all wrong. You know, this can't be anything to do with them.
Every serial killer that's going to be able to continue killing for any length of time is going to be able to present a very respectable public face, which will be at some odds with the private reality to that public face.
It was the start of what quickly became a media frenzy.
The media interest in this case was global. This was a crime that was of great public interest.
Fred's brother Doug and his family were suddenly in the spotlight.
That was just like an explosion. It's like when you see a movie and they're stood still and everything's moving around them. That's what it was like, just frozen.
At that particular time, I could have went and lived on an island on my own. But you can't, because I got responsibilities. I got work responsibilities and family responsibilities.
The depths of the West's depravity were about to be revealed. But if Fred thought he and Rose would stick together, she had other ideas. He was going to be the fall guy, and she'd do all in her power to save her skin. Fred West was taken to Gloucester Police Headquarters for questioning after he confessed to the murder of his 16-year-old daughter, Heather. From the start, he didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what was happening.
Oh, there was no controlling her, Heather. She was the right one. You ain't never seen nothing like it. Never no underwear. Always wore them low-cut tops. Showing off her titties, eh? She was a right one.
It was all very chilling. Fred talked as though everything was absolutely normal.
I never killed her intentionally. It wasn't murder.
As a result of what you did, she died.
That's the bad part.
Fred gives a confession regarding the death of Heather, which is a story part fantasy, part truth, perhaps.
And the body?
Cut her up, like, put her in a bin.
And what about the clothes?
Put them in black bin bags, left them outside the vets. It was bin day.
But he stuck to his pact with Rose, that he'd take the blame.
Nothing to do with her. She don't know nothing about it.
He agreed to show police where Heather was buried. He knew they were close to discovering 2 other bodies in the garden.
Dig down about 4 foot and you'll find her.
Where exactly?
There! No need to go messing up the old blooming garden.
He seems to think that he can get away with Heather being found without them finding the others, which doesn't seem very logical in retrospect, but that seems to be the way his mind was working.
Rose had no idea Fred had confessed, so detectives could set their trap.
Tell me about Heather's disappearance.
Once a child cuts you off, there's not a great deal you can do about it.
When was she last in touch?
She went to visit Fred in the bail hostel. He said she looked rough. I just hope she's out there somewhere in the big bad world.
We should inform you there's been a development. Fred has confessed to murdering Heather.
That drew a huge and shocked gasp from Rose, and she was disturbed and trembling at that point. It was probably one of the most emotional points that I witnessed with Rose in the whole inquiry.
Rose's strategy now became clear. For Fred, the pact was about protecting Rose and one day resuming life together. But Rose simply threw him to the wolves.
So you know where she is?
He's told us where she is.
So she's dead, is she?
We have reason to believe you're involved.
It's a lie. I tell you, if I ever get my hands on Fred, he's a dead man.
Her enmity, venom, turned to Fred, and that was the narrative right the way through. And Fred was the enemy. Fred was the betrayer. Fred was this evil person who'd manipulated and exploited her and killed her daughter.
Police dug where Fred had indicated.
We've got something.
They found one bone fragment they thought might be human. Then they spotted a much bigger object.
And they bring in Professor Bernard Knight, who's a Home Office pathologist. He's perhaps the most eminent pathologist in the country.
Yes, it's a human thigh bone.
I remember looking down into what is essentially a grave and seeing skeletal remains. And I remember in particular seeing black hair.
Her remains indicated Heather had been murdered and dismembered in a frenzy. 7 years earlier, Heather had been killed when she was just 16 years old, because Fred and Rose feared she was about to tell people what had been going on in the house. Professor Knight examined the other bone fragment found earlier.
Definitely human. Definitely not the girl in the hall. You've got some more digging to do.
Police began to realize they were dealing with multiple murders. That day, they interviewed Caroline Owens, the former nanny who'd been threatened with being killed and buried.
That night it came on the news that they'd found remains. But it was 3 lots. Well, it was at least 2 lots. They'd found 3 legs. So, it was all coming true. But the worst thing was when I realised how soon.
In 1972, after her 12-hour torture and rape ordeal, Caroline had dropped a rape charge against the Wests. They were only found guilty and fined £100 for indecent assault.
The worst thing was when they started naming some of the victims they discovered, I realised they started killing 3 months after my court case in 72. And in the following 9 months, they killed 3 girls. And to my mind, if I'd pushed the rape charge, they would have been alive.
The evidence that we were able to gain from the statements made by Caroline Owens were fundamental to the investigation.
Caroline's testimony clearly implicated Rose. Police questioned Fred about the assault on Caroline, and the pact to shield Rose quickly began to crumble.
Done it to test out Rose, like. To see if they'd have lesbian sex together.
That's what you were hoping for?
Bit of bondage.
And murder?
Probably. Could have gotten that far.
Police confronted Rose with the discovery of Heather's body.
Well, we found her in a grave in your garden.
There was a gasp of shock, and Rose remained in I'd say a fairly brittle and distressed state from then on in.
Come. Would you be surprised if we told you there was a second body?
Oh, this is all getting too much!
Police also told Fred they'd found a second body. Concerned about his intellect, they'd appointed an appropriate adult under the Mental Health Act to look after his welfare and to be an independent witness.
Obviously better confess then. Not 1 extra body, but 2. Shirley Robinson. She was a lesbian, like, but she was pregnant with my baby. And Shirley's mate.
Named?
Dunno. Talking a long time ago. She's buried by the bathroom.
He's seen sense, Rose. Told us everything.
Best all round if you do the same as him.
There's something wrong with that bloke altogether.
Rose was arrested for the 2 murders, but allowed home on bail. Fred was charged with murdering Heather. He agreed to show where the 2 further victims were buried, but the police were increasingly concerned about his grip on reality.
Bloody hell do you think you're doing? What's the point in all this, eh? Told you I'd tell you where to dig. Right, you're putting all this back exactly as you found it. Do you hear me?
The first body from the West's many sex killings was found that afternoon. 16-year-old Alison Chambers died in 1979. Around her decapitated skull, The purple belt they'd used to bind her was still in place. 4 hours later, police found Shirley Robinson. She lived in a ménage à trois with Fred and Rose, but her pregnancy had been her death sentence. Next to Shirley's dismembered body lay the skeleton of her unborn child. Police suspected this wasn't the end of it, and they decided to take the house apart in the search for bodies.
Once the police are digging up the inside of Cromwell Street, so I think for the first time Fred appreciated that the game was largely up.
Fred came to a dramatic decision. He instructed his solicitor he wanted to make a fresh confession.
I wrote a statement, which was extremely brief, to hand in to the police.
I get a phone call to say, we've just had this note from Fred's solicitor to say that I want to confess to the murders of an additional 9 approximately.
The problem that I had was he couldn't remember how many he was accepting responsibility for.
We didn't know where these bodies were, we didn't know who they were. We knew we got a big case because of the human remains we already recovered, but to have this sort of scale, gave it a different dimension.
Fred was brought to the cellar to mark out the graves. His behaviour was becoming even stranger.
They're swirling all around me. My girls.
He believed the girls had been in such pain during their torture, it had been merciful for him to murder them.
To Fred, he had a relationship in his head with each of these girls, and they were looking down on him from heaven and were thanking him for what he'd done, because in his head, he'd done them a favour.
It took 5 days to recover the bodies.
It was very claustrophobic down there, quite damp as I recall, and cold, and a very forbidding place really. The excavations were painstaking. It was like archaeology. These bodies had been in there for some time, but we knew that we had to take them out literally piece by piece.
As digging continued, Fred agreed to show police 2 more graves near Much Markle. He said his first wife, Reena, was buried in one, and his 16-year-old lover, Anna McFall, who'd been pregnant with his child when she died, was buried in the field next door, but he couldn't identify the exact spot.
Here maybe?
There.
Or here maybe?
Where?
Different though. It's all changed, hasn't it?
Part of the field that had been re-landscaped, and soil had been put in to level the field out.
Or about here.
Because we excavated a hole as big as an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And we couldn't just get a big digger in there because we were looking for tiny fragments of bones. So it had to be excavated literally by hand.
It took 13 days to find Reena. Her dismembered body was next to a child's plastic boomerang, possibly used to abuse her during the killing. She was murdered because she came looking for her 8-year-old daughter Charmaine in 1971. Fred now became a suspect over the child's disappearance, but his brother Doug knew the dates when Charmaine was likely to have died proved Fred wasn't responsible.
The police was on about him killing Charmaine. I said to him, well, do you want to go back and check the records then?
Doug told police that when Charmaine went missing in June 1971, Fred was in prison.
I said, he couldn't have killed her, could he?
On the 5th of May, 1994, police recovered Charmaine's body behind the West's former home on Midland Road in Gloucester. Rose, then 17, and left looking after the children on her own, had written to Fred in jail, saying how stressful she found it dealing with Charmaine. Police needed to prove she'd done the killing. They found a photo showing a gap where Charmaine had lost milk teeth. The recovered skull showed that by the time she died, Charmaine's teeth had grown a little.
We had a brilliant forensic dentist, and he was able, looking at the skull of Charmaine and the photograph, and superimposing it to say that Charmaine died within 5 or 6 weeks from the date of the photograph.
That placed 8-year-old Charmaine's death squarely in the time Fred was in jail.
It meant that Charmaine was at home on her own with Rose, and that was the evidence that led to her conviction.
One by one, Other bodies were recovered from the house. Fred told police he couldn't remember the names of many.
If you find human remains and you have no idea who they are, the task of identifying those remains is immense.
Fred said all he knew was that many had been hitchhikers or runaways. It took several weeks to identify them all. The first to be found was 21-year-old Swiss student Theresa Siegenthaler, abducted while hitchhiking. She was gagged, bound and raped before being murdered. Next was Shirley Hubbard, a 15-year-old who'd been in care. Then Lucy Partington, a 21-year-old university student. Juanita Mott, an 18-year-old who'd been a lodger in the house. Linda Goff, a 19-year-old nanny. And finally, a 15-year-old girl in care called Carol Ann Cooper. Back in the field, it took 2 months to find Anna McFall. Curled beside her was the fetus of Fred's unborn child. Rose was now in custody. Like Fred, she was charged with murder and rape as each victim was identified.
The idea that she was going to get away completely started to disappear. The doors were closing in on Rose.
Her last hope was to distance herself as much as possible from Fred and blame him. She was about to deliver a lethal blow to one of the most notorious serial killing partnerships in history.
She's brighter than Fred. She's got more sense of self-preservation.
By June 1994, Fred had been charged with 11 murders, Rose with 9. Fred was still under the illusion they could get through this together. On the 30th of June, he was brought to court to be remanded in custody and to see Rose for the first time in 3 months.
I have a very vivid memory of this, which has stuck with me ever since and was a very powerful moment for me personally covering the story. She very, very obviously snubbed him. To my mind, this is an absolutely key point in the whole story.
All rise.
She's brighter than Fred. She's got more sense of self-preservation. She wants to be acquitted at trial. And her method is to say it was all Fred, it wasn't me, I didn't know anything about it. And in fact, the man makes me feel sick.
It's been speculated that Rose was more psychopathic than Fred, in that she abrogated all responsibility and put that onto Fred, which is obviously much more psychopathic than Fred feeling empathy for her and not wanting her to go to prison.
Take them down.
Rose. Rosie.
Over the next 6 months, all the bodies were identified. And in December, the Wests were back in court. Fred was charged with 12 murders, Rose with 10. This time, he'd been warned Rose didn't want to speak to him.
Fred is a psychopath, but with some kind of broken heart. It appears that now this bond's been severed.
In his cell at Winston Green Prison, Fred decided he couldn't live without Rose.
To Rose West. Happy New Year, darling.
And even then, he's writing her a love letter poem saying, "Come to me," which I believe is saying, "Kill yourself too, we'll be together."
Oh, my love, Fred West. Oh, my love, forever and ever.
But Rose has no intention. She's going to go on with her life alone. She's long since outgrown Fred. And now this is the end for her as far as she's concerned.
On New Year's morning, 1995, a prison warder found Fred hanging in his cell.
I was absolutely gutted. I couldn't believe that they'd allowed him to do it. My first thoughts was, she'll get off now. I thought Rose would get off.
Catherine Halliday, a former lover of Fred and Rose, who believes she nearly became a victim, was preparing to give evidence at trial.
I was angry when I found out about Fred topping himself because he'd taken the coward's way out. He wasn't going to get his bit of just reward.
When you heard that he had hung himself, what did you think?
He was a fool to do it. He took the easy way out, didn't he?
I saw my dad's face when he got the phone call. And it broke my heart. Because no matter what he did, he was still his brother. And he never got a chance to talk to him. He never got a chance to find out why or ask him anything.
On the 3rd of October 1995, Rose's trial opened at Winchester Crown Court. She was charged with 10 murders, 2 rapes and 2 indecent assaults. A stream of witnesses, including Rose's mother Daisy and Fred's daughter Anne-Marie, gave evidence against her. Catherine Halliday described how Rose's sadistic sex sessions had gone too far.
It wasn't easy in court because she just stared through me. And I'm very, very much aware of her staring through me, coldly, icily staring through me.
The jury was shown gruesome evidence of the way one of Fred and Rose's victims had been tortured.
When her skull was found, the kind of encasing that went round her head was still there. Even Rose, actually, who was shown the exhibit, blanched.
Caroline Owens, the West's former nanny, described her ordeal in detail.
For the first time in my lifetime, I think, felt self-respect. Felt like I'd done something. I went in there to get justice for the girls that didn't make it. And I helped towards that.
Rose herself gave evidence.
That was, I think, a mistake because she was a very bad witness.
I hated him. I didn't see the man I'd known all those years. I saw a walking figure of evil. And I know it might sound daft, but I saw him with horns and a satanic grin.
The jury didn't believe her, and they weren't swayed by defense complaints the case was compromised because many witnesses had sold their stories. They returned 10 unanimous verdicts of guilty.
The indictment seemed to go on for forever almost. I was watching Rose throughout, and there was absolutely no emotion at all on her face. It was just absolutely stone face.
On the 22nd of November 1995, Rose West was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge recommended she never be released.
She should have known. She took life, she should lose hers.
And people say, how do you feel about the victims' families? Or, hello, it's nice to meet you. Because I am one of the victims' families. I lost 2 cousins, and when I say my name, people look at me like I am evil. And I don't want to hurt anybody. I just want everyone to leave my family in peace.
They knew what they were doing, they knew what they were going to do, and they would have carried on and make no mistake about that. And I, for one, just hope she rots in hell, in prison. I do. I hope she never, ever gets out. Because she's as wicked as he is. They were both as bad as one another.